Hey everybody, welcome to the Midweek Bible Study with me. This is a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. So if you're watching live right now, which book are we covering? I put in the title of the comment section that this is a strange book that never mentions God directly. So if you know what it is, I'd love for you to drop it down in the comment section below and leave any insights that you have as well, or maybe things that I missed. This is going to be a really, it's a unique book, obviously because it never mentions God, but it tends to be the truth that the shorter the book of the Bible, it seems like, I don't want to say the more intentional it is, but there's just so much poetry, I guess, that goes on. So shorter books of the Bible, they tend to so well crafted and intentionally done. Maybe some of the longer books of the Bible, you start to get a lot of like history and a lot of facts that are coming at you, and those are great for other reasons. But today we are looking at Esther. That's right. Esther is the strange book of the Bible that never mentions God. Although that we're going to see he's definitely at work and definitely involved in the process. But I think you'll start to understand that what we mean by it's a strange book here in just a minute. So first up, we're talking about Esther. If you're in a small group setting, this is a great time to hit pause and ask the group what you know about Esther. Who's in it? What happened? When did it happen is a big one. List as many facts as you can in your group now. And if you're watching online, this is a great time to jump in and to start taking a look at the summary. What is this book all about? Now, the story of Esther is set about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. I think that's going to be important for us because a lot of Jews and kind of the camera in the Bible tends to go on with the people, the Ezra and Nehemiah, the people who went back and started rebuilding Jerusalem from the ground up. Remember, Ezra worked on the temple. Nehemiah was kind of the fortifications around the city, and that was real controversial and kind of a strange book that we did last time. This is when the camera angle is staying focused on the remnant in exile that didn't go back, and it's 100 years now after that fact. A few important key places and people. This is happening in the Persian capital. The city's name is Susa. Two main characters are Mordecai and his niece Esther, both Jewish. And the king of Persia makes an appearance, along with the villain, evil Mr. Haman. All right, some facts. Overview is that we've got God is never mentioned in the book. And this is also an invitation to look for God's activity, even though he's not mentioned. So it's kind of a rhetorical technique or a literary structure that the author uses, the author who's never mentioned by name and given credit, to say, like, listen, I'm not going to say exactly what God did. The invitation is for you on a reader to be able to identify some of those areas, maybe on your own or in a group, of where God is moving. So I think this is a cool time, too, in your group setting to ask, like, to list all of the places. The book isn't honestly that long. In fact, we just read through it as a family, just in one entire sitting. And I think it would be cool to go through and to like have a highlighter and just to highlight like God's explicit action and just see how much of it is apparent. Okay, this is going to get interesting now. So I try to do something a little creative with some of the text because I don't want us to miss it. So pay attention as we go through the major movements here. Pay attention to the indentations of the text next to me. The first movement that we have, we're going to call it the king's greatness in Esther 1 and 2. The king has this great feast. It's lasts weeks long. And the king, who's not a great guy in the story, we'll come back to that. The king in this drunken stupor calls for his queen, Queen Vashti, to come and show off her beauty to all of his friends. She says, nothing doing, pal. I'm not coming. Which is good on her, right? She refuses, and he issues a decree that all men be masters of their homes. This is not a great look for Persia, for that king, for men in general. I mean, it's not a good move, right? But the Bible isn't here to dress everybody up and pretend everybody's perfect. God tells the story of the Bible to say, like, people are broken and need a savior. So she's fired as queen, and we never really find out what happens to her. But there's this beauty pageant that ensues. And I just imagine it a lot like The Bachelor. And the king is the bachelor, and they go on these dates. And I don't know, I'm kind of making that whole thing up. But there is a beauty pageant. That's what the story says. Esther enters the beauty pageant, and she hides her Jewish identity. And she never says that she's one of this group of people that was taken into exile hundreds of years previously and kind of made a home here in Babylon and then Persia later on. And she wins the beauty contest. So she gets to become the queen in the whole kingdom. So Mordecai, in the very next scene, Mordecai, her uncle, overhears these two guards plotting a revolt against the king. And so Mordecai goes and he alerts Esther, and then Esther, who's now married to the king, alerts the king, and then Mordecai gets all the credit. So Mordecai's this hero, but listen, he never gets recognized. Chapters 1 and 2 is all about the king's greatness. The king does all this stuff. Mordecai never gets the credit. Well, he gets the credit. He never gets the honor and the recognition publicly for saving the king and potentially the Persian kingdom's life. Now, that's a big deal. So we're kind of invited to ask, what is it that God is up to? We're just kind of like laying the groundwork. Okay, pay attention to the indentations alongside where you have this whole section, 1 and 2, and then you have the next section, which is Esther chapter 3. Esther chapter 3 is Haman is honored. Remember Haman, he's the villain. Well, we're still early on in the story. Haman gets elevated to this position. It's interesting. He's a Canaanite. He's not a Persian. So he's got maybe a little bit of an imposter syndrome. I'm not sure, but it's interesting. Haman says, hey, I'm honored now, and I think everybody has to bow down to me. Well, Mordecai is a Jewish person. He's not bowing down to anybody. Remember the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story, the whole Daniel story? That took place in the capital city. It was called Babylon back then. But, the same story. It's just the names are different. Mordecai's not bowing down, and this enrages Haman, and then he finds out, well, the reason why Mordecai doesn't bow down is because of his faith, his Jewish faith in God, and we shouldn't bow down to anybody except God, and finds out he's Jewish and identifies the Jewishness as the problem, and he's furious. Haman, he rolls a dice. Now, the dice is called a pure. A die is called a pure. 2 dice, plural dice would be pure im. Hebrew im is it's just how to add an S onto things. So he rolls the pure to find out a date, to select a date when all Jews must die because he was slighted in this way. I mean, it's pretty messed up stuff. Okay, Timothy Keller on this. Very interesting. A little bit of a tangent here, but I think helpful. Timothy Keller is a pastor and author, and he writes that Haman, he doesn't name the people he's going to kill, and the king doesn't even ask. And this dehumanizes those that they're going to murder. And how common is it for us to dehumanize those we dislike? I think it's a great point, an observation that he points out, to recognize that what we do when we dislike somebody, or what we do when we feel slighted by somebody, is to take away their identity, to take away their personhood, to dehumanize them. And then it makes it a lot easier for us to mistreat people. So it's totally beside the point, but I want to also say in this study, don't be a Haman, right? Don't be a person that dehumanizes somebody that disagrees with you or somebody that dislikes you. And I think today, with the inauguration and politics and division being so readily apparent, one thing that we can do is to recognize the humanity of all people and to start with recognition that every single person has infinite value and worth, regardless of beliefs or convictions or who they are as people. Simply the fact that God made them and died for them gives them ultimate, infinite value and worth and dignity. Okay, pay attention to, remember, the indentations. We've got Esther 1 and 2 is the first movement, the king's greatness, Haman honored, Esther 4, Mordecai and Esther's plan. Okay, Esther and Mordecai devised this plan to ask the king. Well, there's this decree, remember, from the Purim that all these Jewish people are going to have to die. And so they want to they want to ask about like reversing that decree, but there's a problem, is that they can't approach the king without being invited, being requested. Doing so would be punishable by death. And so there's this great interaction, Esther 4, between Mordecai, her uncle, and his niece Esther, where Esther's a little hesitant. You can check that out. It's kind of an interesting like play to read that chapter and to like, hey, wait a second, is Esther really a hero here? Like I'm not totally convinced on that. But Esther is a little hesitant, and so Mordecai, her uncle, has this incredible speech. Listen, deliverance must come from somewhere. And perhaps you've become queen for such a time as this. Perhaps you've become queen for this moment. And Esther kind of changes her tune and she says, okay, I'll do it. I'll approach the king. I'll risk my life. If I perish, I perish. Well, that's the plan, okay? But it's going to get a little bit more intricate than that. So we're going deeper into the story. And so our indentation is going further and further. Esther has her first banquet. She's going to have two. Haman and the king have a great time at the banquet. And by great time, I mean that the king leaves again in a drunken stupor. However, while this is happening, Haman goes out and he devises this giant stake to impale Mordecai because he's so furious. He has not let this thing go. And he goes, hey, when all the Jews perish, Mordecai's going to be the first one because this thing began with Mordecai. And this awful thing that's going to happen is going to happen to Mordecai first. Okay, listen to this. We get to the end of the indentation, and we have, I called it reverse. This huge, this massive pivot in the story. Mordecai's just about to die. This whole thing has happened. Well, the king goes to bed after his drunken stupor, right? Tries to sleep it off, and he can't sleep. And so he asks for his history, the annals, to be read to him to help him, fall asleep. Well, and they get to the part where he's reminded that Mordecai saved his life. Remember those two guards in the story earlier? And he's like, what? I totally forgot about that. That guy's, I recognize that he was the one, and we recorded it, we wrote it down in the history book, but I never threw on a celebration. I never honored him. I totally forgot. And so the next day, Haman goes to the king with his decree in hand, asking the king to sign off on it to kill Mordecai. But before that happens, the king sees Haman coming. He goes, great, I'm so glad you're here. Remember this one guy who saved my life? His name is Mordecai. We got to honor him. And I just imagine that Haman kind of like just hides the decree behind his back. And he's like, oh, honor him, huh? That's interesting. And so what happens is this great reversal is that Haman actually has to lead Mordecai on a horse all around the capital city of Susa, asking everybody to honor the guy on the horse, Mordecai. And so you see in Esther 6, this dramatic reversal is Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation as he's up on top of this horse. Okay, now we start to unpack it. Remember, there's Esther's first banquet up here. Well, now Esther has a second banquet where she invites the king and she tells the king, okay, listen, I'm going to level with you. That decree that you issued, I'm actually Jewish, so it's going to kill me too. And Haman, by the way, is terrible. And so the king says, okay, you're right. Haman is terrible. And he orders Haman to be impaled on the stake that Haman built for Haman. Again, this dramatic reversal that's taking place here. Esther 8, chapter 8 is Esther and Mordecai's actual plan. Remember in Esther 4, we saw up here, we saw their initial plan, and now they see the actual plan because, as it turns out, the king's decrees are not actually reversible. Once a king issues a decree, it's a decree. So what they do instead is they decide that on this day that this is all going to take place, that these Jewish people are going to lose their lives, that the Jews are now ordered to defend themselves and to, in fact, destroy those who attack them. And that's exactly what happens. Parts 9 and 10 is that Mordecai now is honored and recognized and celebrated. Mordecai gets elevated. He gets a seat right next to the king, and he gets all of the honor that he was once entitled to. Parts 9 and 10, the conclusion of the book, we see that Mordecai's greatness we see Mordecai's ultimate greatness, and that that Haman's family and the enemies of the Jewish people and those plotting over all of the kingdom against the Jewish people are all destroyed. So it's a huge, dramatic moment for the Jewish people to finally be able to not only defend themselves, but it looks like permanently so. And there's this new decree that goes out in that moment that annually, every year, there's going to be 2 days set aside that are going to be feast days. And they call this Purim. Remember the plural, the name of the dice initially. So the dice that initially were supposed to kill all of the Jewish people now have a holiday, a feast, 2 feast days recognized to recognize and celebrate their deliverance. So this day, Purim, which is still celebrated and recognized today, commemorate the Jewish people's deliverance from destruction, and then Mordecai and Esther enjoy safety in exile. All this whole thing happens with Mordecai sitting back, totally redeemed, totally saved, kind of a happily ever after story from that moment on. So I just want to pull back and just make sure we don't miss the intentionality of this whole story, because the whole thing starts with Esther 1 and 2, the king's greatness. It ends with parts 9 and 10, Mordecai's greatness. It goes to Haman being honored, and then we have Mordecai being honored. And then in the middle here, you got Esther's first banquet, sandwiched in between Esther's second banquet, with this great reversal of Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation in the exact middle. And so this is this really cool, kind of beautiful, this beautiful leveraging of every literary technique to drive home the point that God will be with those whom are his people, no matter what, at the center of the story. And we don't want to miss that. But it's also a strange story. There's some notes that we have. There were not great people in this story. In fact, nobody in this story, maybe Mordecai is a pretty good guy, I guess, but nobody in this story is really off the hook. There's all this moral ambiguity, right? There's drinking, there's sex, there's murder, there's violation of the Torah commands, left, right, and center. Mordecai tells his niece, Esther, to hide her Jewish identity, which is kind of akin to lying or lying adjacent. I mean, this is... It's not good. And then you got the fact that God isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible. What is the theme of all of this? Well, when God seems absent and he's not mentioned, and God's people are morally compromised, God has not abandoned his promises. I think Esther is a good story for us to be reminded that it's not up to us in our perfection, and it's not up to our ability to see God moving and our capacity to maybe connect the dots of God. It's irrelevant to those things. What we need to know is the point of Esther is that God has not abandoned his promises. God has not forsaken his people. God has not left you. Even when you can't see him, when you can't connect the dots, and even when you don't deserve, and I don't deserve, the dots to be connected because of our moral failings, because of our faith failings, God has not abandoned his promises. Really interesting to play this field guide for spotting Jesus in the Bible, and to do that with Esther, because God's not even mentioned in the Old Testament book. And so where would Jesus make an appearance? Famous line in Esther, and this is maybe a key verse if you're going to commit something to memory, it would probably be this one. This is Mordecai's words to his niece Esther, encouraging her to go in and talk to the king directly, where he says, "For if you remain silent at this time," time is important, "if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Timing. So important in the book of Esther. So important for God to pick the right time to intervene into human history. Galatians 4 and 5, New Testament book, letter by Paul, where Paul writes to the church then and also to the church today, but when the set time had fully come, like when the fullness of time, when the time was just right, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. This is kind of a cool thought, is that a Jewish people commemorated this with remembering the dice. That was the instrument that chose the time of their death. And they remembered it and made it a time to commemorate deliverance, celebration, joy, and man, life. The death dice became a symbol of life. That Christians have a day to set aside. Not a feast day for 2 days out of the year, but Christians have a day set aside to celebrate life and joy and deliverance. We call it Sunday. Every weekend, we worship and we sing and we praise God and we hear from him in his word. We celebrate deliverance. We celebrate joy. We celebrate the new life that Christ brings us in the fullness of his time. If you're watching this in a group setting, I'm going to leave these discussion questions on the screen for just a moment. You can hang out and talk a little bit about Esther and what did you see? Where was God moving in the book? What were you surprised by? I'm glad that you stopped by. We'll see you again next Wednesday at noon, right back here. Take care.